In the second week of May 1943, the sea behind Cape Bon looked calm. Too calm, no troopships, no rescue convoy, not even a funnel on the horizon. On the road below the hills, German and Italian vehicles stood nose to tail, empty fuel tanks ticking in the heat. Officers fed maps and code sheets into oil drums. One sergeant removed the bolt from his rifle, threw it into one ditch, then hurled the weapon into another. He was not surrendering in panic. He was doing the final arithmetic, every mile lost since El Alamein, every tanker sunk, every transport aircraft shot down, every order to hold ground that could no longer be supplied, and all along the road hands began to rise. By May 13, roughly 250,000 Axis troops had surrendered in Tunisia. It was the largest Axis capitulation of the war up to that moment. And the one man whose name the world attached to the army in Africa was not there. Erwin Rommel had been gone for 2 months. The famous commander did not make a last stand. He did not lead the final defense. He did not sign the surrender. The force collapsing against the coast was not even, strictly speaking, the Afrika Korps. It was something much larger. Army Group Africa. 2 armies. German and Italian. Veterans of 2 different campaigns, compressed into one shrinking pocket with the Mediterranean at their backs. And by the time the final Allied offensive began, that sea was no longer an escape route. It had become a wall. Rommel understood the trap before most of the men inside it did. On March 9, 1943, he left North Africa and flew to meet Hitler. His argument was blunt. Tunisia could not be held indefinitely. The bridgehead should be evacuated while ships and aircraft could still carry experienced troops back to Europe. Hitler refused. He saw Tunisia as a delay mechanism. As long as Axis forces remained there, the Allies would have to spend time, men, aircraft, and ammunition clearing them out before they could cross to Sicily. So Hitler chose to trade an army for time. Rommel was placed on sick leave and kept away from the front. The change was handled quietly. Berlin did not want the Allies to know that the Desert Fox was no longer on the board. He never returned. The command passed to Colonel General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim on March 10. Not a field marshal. Not Rommel's equal in public fame, but the officer who would inherit every consequence of a decision already made above him. Above von Arnim stood Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding the Mediterranean theater from Italy. Above Kesselring stood Hitler, still insisting that Tunisia be held. The man on the ground was ordered to defend a position his predecessor had already called impossible. And the impossibility did not begin with the last Allied attack. It began over the water. The popular picture of the North African War is a duel of tanks and generals across open desert. But Tunisia was decided by logistics. Army Group Africa existed because 2 separate Axis forces had been driven into the same corner. From the east came the exhausted veterans of the Desert Campaign. Formations that had retreated more than 1,000 miles from Egypt after defeat at El Alamein. They became the core of the Italian First Army, the successor to the old German-Italian Panzer Army Rommel had once commanded. From the west and north came the 5th Panzer Army, rushed into Tunisia after the Allied landings in French North Africa. One Axis force had been retreating west. The other had been thrown south. The map forced them together. By spring, the German 5th Panzer Army held much of the north. The Italian First Army held the south. Over both sat Army Group Africa. The actual German Afrika Korps still existed, but only as one corps-sized component inside that larger structure. That distinction matters, because the 250,000-man surrender was not the destruction of one German corps. It was the capture of an entire army group, and an army group in Tunisia could survive only if men, fuel, ammunition, and food kept crossing the Sicilian Narrows. The Allies set out to stop all of it. In the air, the campaign became known as Operation Flax. Allied fighters hunted the German transport fleet between Sicily and Tunisia. Slow Junkers Ju-52s lumbered over the sea with men and supplies. Giant 6-engine Messerschmitt Me-323s carried vehicles and heavy cargo. They were valuable. They were also slow, conspicuous, and terribly vulnerable. In April, Allied fighters caught major transport formations over the water and tore them apart. Aircraft went down carrying fuel, spare parts, technicians, and reinforcements that would never reach Africa. Every transport loss did 2 things at once. It starved the bridgehead, and it destroyed one more possible way out. At sea, the Royal Navy tightened the second half of the trap. The operation was called Retribution. Admiral Andrew Cunningham's intention was simple. Nothing was to pass through the Narrows if Allied ships could stop it. Destroyers, submarines, patrol craft, aircraft, and minefields turned the crossing into a killing ground. The bridgehead was not sealed in one dramatic moment. It was sealed shipment by shipment. A tanker that never arrived, a transport sunk at night, a formation of aircraft lost in minutes. A convoy turned back, a harbor emptied. By late April, the Axis army in Tunisia was still fighting. But the machinery that could sustain or evacuate it was already disappearing. Hitler finally approved evacuation measures near the end of April. By then, permission had become meaningless. There were too few aircraft, too little air cover, too few ships, too much Allied control over the sea. Only a tiny fraction of the trapped force escaped to Europe. There would be no Dunkirk in Tunisia, no improvised armada, no miracle across the water, no last-minute recovery of a veteran army. The sea looked open, but operationally it was closed. The Allies then prepared to crush the bridgehead from the land. General Harold Alexander's 18th Army Group coordinated the final campaign. Under it were three major forces. The British First Army under Lieutenant General Kenneth Anderson pressing from the west. The British 8th Army under Bernard Montgomery, coming from the southeast after the long pursuit from Egypt, and the United States Sioux Corps, now under Major General Omar Bradley, rebuilt after the humiliation at Kasserine Pass. Three armies, multiple national commands, one tightening ring. The first phase began on April 22. Operation Vulcan. For 2 weeks, Allied forces attacked across the perimeter, forcing the Axis defenders to burn fuel, ammunition, reserves, and strength they could not replace. But the line did not simply collapse. In the south around Enfitaville, the Italian First Army used steep, broken ground to stop the Eighth Army. Frontal attacks gained little and cost heavily. The terrain favored defenders who still knew how to fight, even when their supply system was dying. Vulcan exposed a crucial truth. The Allies did not need to push everywhere. They needed to break one place that mattered. Alexander shifted the weight of the offensive. Veteran formations, including the 4th Indian Division and the 7th Armored Division, moved toward the First Army front. Artillery, infantry, and armor concentrated on the shorter road to Tunis. The Axis command kept watching the pressure in the south. The decisive blow was forming in the center. Operation Strike began before dawn on May 6. Its concept was brutally narrow. Do not spread the guns across the whole front. Pack them together. Hammer a corridor only a few miles wide. Then drive armor through the wound before the defense can close. Hundreds of Allied guns opened fire. The British 4th Division and 4th Indian Division advanced behind the barrage. The attack punched through the Axis line, and armored formations surged into the gap. The 6th Armored Division, the 7th Armored Division, the Desert Rats. They did not stop to reduce every pocket. They drove for Tunis. Strike began on May 6. Tunis fell on May 7. To the north, the United States Sicily Corps entered Bizerte the same day. 2 cities, 2 ports, one afternoon, and the Axis defense lost its shape. The capture of Tunis was more than the fall of a capital. The Allied armored thrust split Army Group Africa apart. The northern and southern forces could no longer coordinate effectively. Roads toward Cape Bon were threatened or cut. Command posts lost contact. Fuel dumps were abandoned. Units that had held together for months were suddenly isolated from one another. A front can survive pressure for a long time. What it cannot survive is the loss of exits, ports, communications, and a common direction. Once Tunis and Bizerte were gone, the army did not merely retreat, it fragmented. The final collapse took 6 days. On May 7, the key ports fell. By May 13, organized resistance was over. A fast Allied motorized thrust crossed the base of the Cape Bon Peninsula and reached the eastern coast near Korba, closing the last land route into the peninsula. After that, surrender became less a battlefield event than a chain reaction. One formation discovered the road ahead was blocked. Another learned that its neighbor had disappeared. A headquarters burned its papers. A fuel column stopped. A battalion commander realized there was no ammunition coming. Then men began walking toward Allied lines in groups. Then companies, then entire units. The Allies had not prepared for the scale. Prisoner facilities had been built for around 70,000 men. Higher estimates had allowed for perhaps twice that number. The actual total surged far beyond both. Roads filled with prisoners. Fields became temporary cages. Weapons piled into heaps. Guards watched columns so large that escape had almost no practical meaning. Where could 250,000 men go? The northern half of the Axis force disintegrated first. The German 5th Panzer Army, then commanded by General Gustav von Wehrst, ceased to function as an army. Its commander was captured as the structure around him collapsed. Von Arnim held out longer. On May 12, troops of the 4th Indian Division captured him in the hills near Sainte-Marie-du-Zit, southwest of Hammamet. The commander of Army Group Africa entered British custody not at a port, not aboard a ship, and not beside Rommel. He was taken inland, cut off from the coast that had once connected his army to Europe. The final organized resistance came from the south. Marshal Giovanni Mess commanded the Italian First Army around Enfitaville. His troops had held difficult ground and delayed Montgomery's 8th Army, but delay was no longer strategy. With the northern pocket gone and all escape routes closed, Metz surrendered on May 13. In the final hours, Mussolini promoted him to Marshal of Italy. The last Axis army commander in Africa received his highest rank just before laying down the last army. And then the campaign ended. No final duel, no last armored charge across the desert, no Rommel at the center of the frame. Only exhausted formations surrendering under commanders most of the public would barely remember. The numbers explain why the myth became so distorted. The phrase 250,000 is broadly fair for the total Axis surrender in Tunisia, but it is not a German number, and it is not an Afrika Korps number. The British official history recorded 243 unwounded prisoners. Of that exact total, 101,784 were German, 89,442 were Italian. Roughly 47,000 more were men of other nationalities serving within the Axis system. Other official and historical estimates rise toward 250,000 or even 275. Zone when wounded personnel, rear area troops and different counting methods are included. So the honest statement is not difficult. About 250,000 Axis troops surrendered in Tunisia. A little over 100,000 of them were German by the most precise unwounded count. Nearly 90,000 were Italian. The rest came from other national groups caught inside the same collapse. That is still catastrophic. It simply belongs to Army Group Africa, not to the Afrika Korps alone. The comparison with Stalingrad is also real, but it has to be handled carefully. In early February 1943, around 91,000 men of the German 6th Army surrendered at Stalingrad. 3 months later, the total Axis surrender in Tunisia was more than twice as large. In raw prisoner numbers, Tunisia was the greater capitulation. But much of that difference came from the multinational character of Army Group Africa. Tunisia included nearly 90,000 Italians and tens of thousands of others. Compare only German prisoners and the disasters become much closer. Tunisia was not 3 German Stalingrads, it was something more precise. Another German army-sized catastrophe, joined to the destruction of a major Italian army, only 3 months after the Volga disaster. German troops had their own word for it, Tunisgrad. The name captured what official language could not. This was not merely the end of a campaign. It was the second great Axis mass surrender of 1943, and this time it opened the central Mediterranean. With Tunisia lost, the Axis had no forces left in Africa. The Allies controlled the southern side of the Narrows. In July, they landed in Sicily. The bridgehead Hitler had sacrificed an army to preserve delayed them only briefly. The army bought time, but not enough time to justify its destruction. And the destruction revealed the final weakness in the legend of the Desert War. The legend remembered one commander, one corps, one long duel across the sand. The reality at the end was larger, less romantic and far more mechanical. A multinational army group had been fused together by retreat. Its air bridge was cut. Its sea lanes were closed. Its fuel and ammunition were consumed. Its ports were taken in a day. Its command was split. Its roads were sealed. And once the land front cracked, the entire structure collapsed in 6 days. Rommel had predicted the trap. Hitler had refused to leave it. Von Arnim had been ordered to hold it. Messi had defended its last southern edge. And hundreds of thousands of soldiers discovered that courage cannot reopen a sea lane. At Cape Bon, the Mediterranean was still blue, still calm, still empty. It looked like the last road home. But the road had already become a wall, and Africa's most famous army died under another man's command, while its most famous commander was a continent away.